For the past 4 years, Fire Emblem has been one of my favorite franchises. The series is filled to the brim with captivating war stories, intricate worlds, tight gameplay, beautiful music, lovable characters, hot waifus, dickish RNG, poor balancing, ambush spawns, and a bunch of other good and bad qualities I'm too out of breath to mention. Since I've finally played every mainline entry in this tactical RPG franchise, I thought I'd rank them all, just as I did with Mario and Kirby a year back. Only the mainline games, that is, which means no BSFE, no TMS, no warriors, and thankfully, no heroes. I left mainline out of the title of the video since Fire Emblem doesn't have nearly as many spin-offs as Kirby, or especially Mario. With the rules out of the way, it's time to bare our fangs. Do I have to talk about Fire Emblem Fates again? Before we start, I just want to say that I have warmed up to Fates a little bit since my video on it way back when. The art direction and soundtrack are fantastic, some of the characters are likable, it makes a few much needed improvements to Awakening's formula, and in Conquest specifically, the gameplay can actually be pretty fun sometimes. With that said, Fire Emblem Fates is still bad. Really bad. To start, Corrin is character-wise the worst protagonist in the series by far. Since they're forced to take the roles of both the self-insert avatar and the main lord, they struggle to fit either role, and they wind up coming off as flat. It doesn't help that they're insufferably naive, they always make the worst possible decisions outside the big one issued by the player, and at no point do they ever feel like they grow or develop as a character. Most of the other characters are not much better. There are some good characters, like I said, but the majority are either really bland or really annoying. How am I supposed to struggle to pick a side when they're both packed with stale soldiers? Speaking of which, let's get to the game's selling point. Choosing your own path. After haphazardly rushing through introductions, the game makes you choose a side, the only big decision it makes you do. And you had to pay for each route individually as if they were separate games. And if you think each choice has a vastly different outcome, think again. What seems like a brilliant premise for 2 stories winds up boiling down to kick Garen's ass, and kick Garen's ass, now with extra plot holes and stupidity. Is the gameplay any better? Honestly, not much. Birthright is boring as sin. It has 0 difficulty and its maps are painfully drawn out. To give Conquest credit, it does have a few highs, but it also has plenty of lows. The lows get progressively more abundant the further you go on, to the point where the game just stops being fun. I'm honestly getting real sick of people saying Conquest is the best gameplay in the series just because Chapter 10 slaps, which, to be fair, it does. And then there's Revelation. The mere concept of the route renders the game's selling point moot, and, by extension, goes against a major recurring theme in the franchise, the damage of war. The maps are riddled with annoying gimmicks and horrible design. The story makes no goddamn sense, on top of undermining Birthright and Conquest's already garbage stories, introducing the worst villain in the franchise by far, and having a hollow, unearned, and borderline manipulative ending. What's the point of the choices if you're gonna wind up giving us a golden route? Is it so you can let us make babies with everyone, even our own siblings? Is it so you guys can take the wrong lessons from Awakening and pander to its fans? Is it so you can ignore what the series truly is and make it into an otaku's paradise? Whatever the reason is, I don't care. Thank Naga it's unavailable now. I don't think I'd outright call Fates the worst Fire Emblem, but it is undoubtedly my least favorite. I never want to see the series fuck up this badly again. Fire Emblem Gaiden is a tactical RPG released for the NES in 1992. You could probably guess what it's like from that first sentence alone, but I have to keep going. As a matter of fact, I actually didn't mind Gaiden at first. I liked its use of the world map with how it displayed the full scale of Valentia. I liked how the class system works, especially since some classes could promote multiple times. I liked the changes made to items, and I also liked the music quite a bit. However, my enjoyment began to wear off once I beat Act 1, and once I beat Act 2, I was already sick and tired of the game. It already carries over most of FE1's biggest issues, like the slow animations and clunky UI. If that wasn't enough, the map design is utterly abysmal. It might be the worst map design in the whole series. They're often bland, empty fields with invasive terrain and terrible enemy variety. I feel like they simplified the map so the game could fit onto an NES cartridge, but in that case, why didn't they just make the game for the SNES? Gaiden also introduces dungeons, and they suck. They're all just walk forward, fight, walk forward, fight. Did I mention that the monsters you fight in the dungeons are ridiculously overpowered? What's that? You're saying I should grind? Good idea. If only you didn't gain experience at such a slow rate in this game. Apparently there's a cheat code that doubles experience, but I had no idea it existed when I played. All these issues resulted in me dropping the game at the beginning of Act 4, and seeing what the rest of the game is like, I'm glad I didn't go on. TLDR, Fire Emblem Gaiden is a slow, repetitive, frustrating, and weirdly sexist mess of a game that you should only play if you have the patience of a Buddhist monk. So why did I rank it over Fates? It's simple. Gaiden tried to do something interesting, but it was merely held back by its limited hardware. It also fully knows what the series is, despite only being the second installment, and doesn't try to pander to the incel crowd. Sure, it's slow and dated, but at least it doesn't take a huge dump on the series' identity. I played 4 chapters of FE1 and decided that was all I needed to play. Okay, for real, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light is a clear example of first game syndrome. The story and characters aren't anything spectacular, but they're about as interesting as you could get with the Famicom. If there's anything FE1 has going for it narratively, it would be its world building. Though Arcanea is much better developed in later installments, it's still fairly cohesive in this game. It's interesting just going around the continent and learning all about it, and each nation feels like it serves a purpose. Gameplay-wise, well, it's Fire Emblem 1. As far as first entries go, the map design is pretty solid. The paths are straightforward, and there are a decent amount of goodies and side objectives. That's everything nice I have to say about FE1. The rest of it sucks. Just like Gaiden, FE1 is painfully slow. Simply moving your cursor and identifying units is super clunky. You can't see units' movement ranges, so you have to open and close their stat menus and manually map them out. The battle animations, while well made, are super drawn out and repetitive, especially since you'll be seeing them all the time. Turning the animations off only makes the sprites stationary, which saves a couple of seconds at most. You can't trade items to and from units. You can only give but not take, which is very limiting. Also, for some godforsaken reason, you have to pay gold to store items in the supply, which there is only one of in each map it appears in. It's no wonder they removed that restriction in FE2, and it hasn't been seen again since. Outside of FE4, that is, but that game actually handled it somewhat decently, so it gets a pass. The amount of promotion opportunities you get is very limiting, with how certain items are tied to certain classes, and some classes aren't even able to promote at all. I get that you're expected to lose some units along the way, but is there any reason to restrict growth that much? There is some novelty that comes with playing the first Fire Emblem, but said novelty wears off by the end of the first chapter, and you're much better off experiencing the game through YouTube or one of its subsequent remakes. Granted, FE3 Book 1 cuts some content and FE11 looks like this, but you're far better off with those as opposed to the unbridled slowness of the original. As much as I respect FE1 for laying the series' foundations, there is zero reason to play it these days. Let's move on. I don't like Binding Blade. Now, I'm well aware that Binding Blade has a lot of fans. I just so happen to not be one of them. Anyway, being the first Fire Emblem without Kaga, Insys decided to take a slightly simpler direction with the story and gameplay, and they thankfully didn't murder the series this time. Wink wink. This would have been a good decision if they didn't decide to make the gameplay really friggin' annoying. For some reason, they decided to make most of the regular enemies much stronger than usual. While this does encourage you to optimize your strategies to eliminate as many threats as possible, it gets very overwhelming having to deal with so many strong soldiers each turn, especially since a lot of the units you get in this game are kinda wimpy. The main lord, Roy, is especially weak, and he doesn't get remotely good until he promotes in chapter 21, near the end of the game. As such, dragging his fragile ass across so many large seas maps gets old real quick. Leaf was also kinda pathetic in Thracia, but at least he had a great starter weapon and Crusader scrolls to help him out, none of which Roy has. He's not even that good of a character either. He honestly might be the most boring protagonist in the whole series. He may not be insufferably stupid like Corrin, but he has no personal stakes or growth whatsoever throughout the story. He might as well just be a cardboard cutout. Seriously, how did this plank get into Smash before King DDD? The rest of the cast is fine. They're held up by the introduction of support conversations, which do a good job at fleshing the characters out, alongside their relationships. The story, for what it is also decent enough, even if it's mostly carried by how great of a villain Zephiel is. Back to the gameplay, the map design is absurdly annoying. There are a handful of chapters that put up a fun, fair challenge, but the majority of them feel like a test to see how much bullshit you can endure. Since there's a true ending alongside a bad one, simply seizing the throne isn't enough to win sometimes. Instead, you have to beat maps quickly or keep specific units recruited and alive throughout the game to unlock Gaiden chapters. All of them are either boring, annoying, frustrating, or all of the above, and you have to unlock and complete all 7 of them if you're after the true ending. And the ambush spawns. Dear gods, the ambush spawns. One of my most hated things about the franchise are the ambush spawns, or same turn reinforcements, and they might actually be at their worst in Binding Blade. They're still bad in the DS games and Awakening, but at least they don't move the turn they spawn on normal mode in those games. Regardless of what difficulty you're on in FE6, you'll be doing so well, and then boom! You get sniped by a wyvern you had no idea was coming until it hit you. I kinda get why a lot of people like this game, and it's perfectly fine if you do, but I don't see myself ever playing this game again. I'll just stick with Thracia if I want to play a good hard Fire Emblem.
Hey, you. You're finally awake.
Fire Emblem Awakening is the game that saved the series, made it big, and not much else. I actually think Awakening gets off to a pretty solid start. Nothing amazing outside chapters 9 and 10, but it does a decent job at introducing us to Elise and its cast. It has an interesting premise of trying to prevent another war from breaking out, and it gets really intense as Gangrel keeps raising the stakes. The interactions between the characters are a lot of fun, and they do a good job at introducing them. The maps are a bit generic, but the game is still relatively fun and fair at this point. Also, the music is great. Not only are a lot of tracks bangers, but instead of having dedicated battle themes, the map themes get more intense and bombastic in battles. It's a genius change, and I'm very glad it became a series staple going forward. Back to the story, remember how I complimented the war's build-up? Well, unfortunately, they kill off Gangrel in chapter 11. Out of 26. As you can probably guess, this is where problems arise. After Gangrel is dealt with, the story completely shifts its focus to a war on Valm against Walmart brand Rudolph. Barely anything of note happens on Valm. You could remove it from the script and little would change. Honestly, I feel like the people who like this game's story only like it because they like the characters. And I'll admit it, Awakening's characters, barring most of the villains, are great. While a bit tropey, they have quite a bit of depth and charm, and they play off each other really well. Anyway, the story builds up to a rushed, nonsensical, and utterly lousy finale, complete with the worst final map in the series. Speaking of which, remember when I called the maps a bit generic? Sadly, they don't get much better than that. Every map is either route or kill the boss, and they rarely have any special mechanics or side objectives to help them stand out. Most of the ones that do are optional paralogs. Some of them are fun, but others can screw off. There are some solid maps, but most of them are pretty bland. But do you want to know my biggest problem with Awakening? It's super unbalanced. Once your units and their bonds get stronger than steel, pairing them up can basically let them solo entire maps, effectively removing the strategy from this strategy RPG. It is kind of fun to see how hard you can break the game, but that doesn't change how easy pair-up makes this game. While I still like Awakening, and I'm very glad it saved the series from the Nintendo graveyard, I can't help but feel like it's aged pretty poorly due to its mediocre story and unbalanced gameplay. Not a bad game, but not exactly groundbreaking either.
Oh man, am I fucking stoned.
Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones was the third and final game in the series on the Game Boy Advance, and the only one to not take place in a lab. To start, Erica and Ephraim are great protagonists. They have a great bond and strong character arcs as well. The rest of the characters are also really good. They have plenty of depth and solid chemistry with one another. This game has some really good villains as well, such as Valter, Selena, Orson, and especially Leon. They're paired up with an interesting story about dealing with loss and expectations, as well as gameplay, which is fine. The map design is fairly solid, with some good enemy variety, especially with the return of the monsters from Gaiden. Also returning from Gaiden is the world map. They don't do a whole lot with it, but it's nice if you want to go back and grind for experience. However, grinding can overpower your units, making the game even easier than it already is. I can sometimes excuse low difficulty if the game still provides fun, inventive gameplay, but this is not one of those times. After saving Renee from a necrophile and reuniting the twins again, I kinda got the gist of the game and only continued to see how the story wrapped up. I spent the last 5 chapters just waiting for the game to end while all the enemy forces were effortlessly cut down by my overpowered army. I went with Ephraim's route first and had little desire to do Erica's route after. I tried getting around to her route recently, but didn't get very far. I say this as someone who beat all 4 routes of 3 houses before playing Sacred Stones. Don't get me wrong, I want to love this game as much as its biggest fans, especially given how fantastic its best attributes are. The characters are great, the visuals are eye candy, the music is absolutely beautiful. I just wish the gameplay was a bit more fun and challenging. Overall, Sacred Stones is a decent game with a great story and cast of characters. It's just not really something I feel like coming back to.
Hey, you get it? This is the title and the point of the whole story!
Color me impressed. Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia actually managed to make Gaiden kinda good. With that said, Shadows of Valentia is far from great. They didn't bother fixing the maps, and while they are more bearable to play on thanks to the smooth UI, they're still really bad. The damsel in distress problem was not addressed, and there are several questionable writing choices, particularly in Act 4. With the bad stuff over with, let's get to the good stuff. Since I played this after Gaiden, I was able to appreciate how much more fleshed out Valentia is in this game. Remember the units who were little more than portraits and numbers? They're actual charming characters now. Remember when Alm remarked about how he and Celica used to play together as kids? Those events are now covered in the new prologue. This game gives so much life to Valentia that the NES just couldn't. And the story, while not amazing, amazing, does a solid job at fleshing out the plot of an NES game. The elephant in the room regarding the story is the new villain, Berkut. He acts as a great parallel to Alm, and he gets progressively more insane with each fight. Not to mention, Ian Sinclair does a stellar job voicing him. Take a listen.
Which makes him the rightful successor to the Imperial throne.
Oh, come on!
The voice acting in general is phenomenal. Every character sounds exactly as they should, and the actors' performances elevate their respective scenes greatly. It sucks that Insys didn't bother fixing the maps, but you want to know what they did fix? The dungeons! They're actually fun now! Encountering enemies by running into them on the field a la Paper Mario is way more fun than walking forward, and they have so many more paths and goodies than before. The art style is stellar, the music is incredible. The FMVs are honestly a big downgrade from Awakening of Fates, but the rest of the presentation is outstanding. If they revamped the maps and fixed up a few parts of the story, I'd probably consider Shadows of Valentia to be one of my favorite games in the series. As it stands though, it's proof that even a game as unfun as Fire Emblem Gaiden can become fun with a bit of work. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I was not looking forward to Fire Emblem Engage. I prayed for its initial leaks to be false, whined on Twitter when they turned out to be true, and continued to dread the game for the next 5 months, even when it got really good first impressions. Then I played the game for myself, and I really liked it. To be fair, Engage didn't exactly engage me from the start. The story gets off to a very tedious start, full of monotonous exposition and a leer simping. Luckily, after a few chapters, the writing goes from cringe to fairly tolerable, and it stays that way for the remainder of the game. Still an aggressively mid-tier story, but hey, it's far better than the nostalgia-pandering dumpster fire I expected going in. Speaking of nostalgia, Engage brings back former lords as emblems, spirits who fight alongside bonded units in battle. All their abilities are not only useful, but they also pay homage to the games they came from. Optimizing which emblems to use at which time is really satisfying. They may seem overpowered, but given what you're up against, you're gonna need that kind of power. I was kinda thrown off by how difficult this game could get at times. It's a real head-scratcher. It helps that the maps are very well made, with only a small handful of bad or forgettable ones. They tend to have interesting layouts and mechanics that encourage even more strategic thinking. It's also really cool to have the optional paralogs be returning maps from previous games with their original music. Plus, while I think other entries have better 2D art, this might be the best the series has ever looked in 3D. I'm still pretty iffy on most of the character designs, but the vibrant environments, expressive models, and fluid animations are a massive step up from 3 polygons. So yeah, I didn't think I'd like it that much, but Fire Emblem Engage is really good, and I can't wait to see what Insys does with the series next. I hope they start with making a better UI, because what the f*** is this?
As a friend, you are irreplaceable.
Finally, a good version of FE1! Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon is the proper remake of the original game, now on the DS in a playable and fun state. The maps are still as strong as ever, though they did get a few tweaks, which thankfully don't go overboard and ruin them. Isn't that right, Splatoon 3? They're helped out by the fact that the UI is actually good now. Also, for the first time in the series, you can finally skip battles in enemy phases. It's a massive time saver, and I don't know why Insys took 11 games to implement it. The enemy line of sight returns from Tellius, and it's much more intuitive here than it was there. For being a remake of the first game that released overseas and featuring a wide range of quality of life improvements, Shadow Dragon is one of the most important games in the series by far, and most people don't acknowledge it. Also, the soundtrack is phenomenal. The new tracks and remixes of old ones are really well done, and I'm also just glad to hear more than 2 map themes. With all that said, Shadow Dragon is not exactly great. It's really dumb that you have to let your units die to play Gaiden chapters, and I'm super glad FE12 did away with that. Also, the art style is, certainly something, but my biggest complaint with Shadow Dragon is what it doesn't do. It barely does a thing to flesh out the story and characters more than the NES era. Shadows of Valentia and even New Mystery to some extent do much more with their characters. It's a shame too, because the few attempts this game makes to flesh things out are really effective, especially the prologue, which does a great job detailing Marth's escape from Altea. Even though it could have been better, Shadow Dragon is still a very good game, and one of the best in the series to start with.
Let them all go, but more!
Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem is 2 games in 1, labeled as books. Book 1 is nothing special. It's a remake of the first game that cuts out a few characters and chapters to free up space in the cartridge. It's still better than FE1 by virtue of having a functional UI, but you're still much better off playing Shadow Dragon. Book 2, on the other hand,
This is where the fun begins.
Book 2 is the sequel to FE1, the main course of the package. Since strong units are a little hard to come by in the Stone Age of Fire Emblem, you can now modify your unit's growth rates with the Star Sphere shards. They can help weaker units stand toe-to-toe with the rest of your army, even if they can also make some units busted beyond belief. Also, dismounting is there. It works well for balancing Cavs and Flyers movement compared to footlocked units, but it can get annoying having to deal with the stat and equipment changes. The map design may be a bit weaker than before with a handful of downright terrible ones, but there is still some good to be seen in it. I quite like how it often uses enemy reinforcements to encourage you to hurry up. The battle animations are much more fluid and fun to watch than they were on the NES, but they're still a little slow. Luckily, you can now properly turn them off to save time. I was also kind of intrigued by the story. It might have a handful of dumb moments, especially around the beginning, but it ends up developing Arcanea in a satisfying way. We learn so much about its lore, and all of it ties very well into a cohesive world and narrative. Hearing Jagan and Zane explain the history of Henri and Medius respectively is quite depressing. I would have had much stronger feelings about Hardin's fall to the darkness if he was more fleshed out beforehand, but I still felt bad having to kill him for the sake of the world. Mystery of the Emblem may be a bit dated in terms of controls and design, and while I do, spoiler alert, think the DS remake is way better, it's undoubtedly one of the most important entries in the series, by far.
I am Ferdinand von Iron.
Fire Emblem Three Houses was the first Fire Emblem I played on official hardware, and let me just say, I picked a real good first purchase. There's a lot to unpack with this game, and I'm not sure if I can fit it all into one segment, but I'll try. It starts where most of the series doesn't go, before the war. Well before it, actually. You start out as a newly hired professor for the Officers Academy at Garreg Mach Monastery, where you spend half the game training your units for the incoming war. You want to know what one of, if not my favorite part of Fire Emblem is? Training up your army and seeing them promote and become stronger than ever. There are so many different classes, leaving lots of room for mixing and matching. Three Houses might just have the best use of classes in the whole series. Nearly every unit starts out as a generic commoner or noble, but you can put them in different roles depending on how proficient they are with certain weapons and skills. This provides lots of open opportunities for different class loadouts. If that wasn't enough, every class can use nearly any weapon type, leading to even more mixing and matching. It may sound broken, and in many cases it is, but I love it. As much as it pads out the game to feel way longer than it should, I really like winding down to the monastery in between chapters to strengthen my units and their supports. The battalions are another good addition, as they can help stun large groups of enemy units while strengthening your own. And despite a few stinkers, the map design is solid enough. This brings me to the story and characters. First, second, I'm glad Insys learned from their mistakes and gave us an avatar character who acts purely as a vehicle for the other characters' stories. Byleth rarely steals the spotlight from the actual main characters. It sucks when they do, but these moments are few and far between. Besides, they don't even talk. The actual main characters, Dimitri, Claude, and Edelgard, are all very interesting characters in their own ways, and the other members of the three respective houses are also quite well developed. The game does a great job building up to the war in the first half, leading to a heart-pounding battle in Chapter 12. But once you reach the time skip, the cracks in the game start to show. As strong as the first half is, the second feels half-baked in comparison. Verdant Wind doesn't do much in regards to Claude's wish to make peace between Folin and Elmyra. Silver Snow is just Verdant Wind without Claude and Nemesis. Crimson Flower is way too short, and even Azure Moon, which is by far the best and most complete of the four routes, still left a few loose threads. The war can still get heart-wrenching due to how many former friends you have to strike down. Unlike Fates, it actually feels earned since we spent half the game hanging out with them as equals, and it once again proves how good this series can be with showcasing the damage war can cause. Three Houses may be flawed as hell and probably could have used some more time in the oven, but I still love it for how many great things it brought to the table.
What happened to Dorcas?
I put poison in his mutton.
Fire Emblem, or Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade in Japan, or Fire Emblem Blazing Sword for those with brains, was the first mainline entry to make its way overseas. And let me just say, they picked a great game to start the series' overseas run with. Reason number one, it starts with a very in-depth tutorial on how to play the game. Sure, it's annoying that you have to play it in your first playthrough, unless you're Japanese and can link up with Binding Blade, but it does a thorough, well-told explanation on how to play the game without ever insulting the player's intelligence. For this reason, I believe Blazing Sword is by far the best Fire Emblem game to start the series with. Just play through Lynn's campaign and you're pretty much set. Reason number two, even after the tutorial, Blazing Sword is still a very fun time. There's a wide variety of map layouts and objectives, making each ordeal quite different from the last. The maps are also full of side objectives, rewarding tight planning and quick thinking. Don't get me wrong, there are a few bad maps, but the good greatly outweighs the bad. The characters are also really endearing. I might be a little biased biased towards this cast since this game was my first Fire Emblem, but they're generally really charming and interesting, and their chemistry with each other is excellent. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the story they're a part of. Yeah, you heard me. I don't like the story of FE7. It's honestly the only thing holding me back from putting this game in the top 5. It has some good moments, but it feels really aimless and repetitive for the most part. It's meant to be a prequel to Binding Blade, but outside a few chapters involving Zephyl, which actually add quite a bit to his character, it adds nothing of note to that game's story, and it ends up feeling like a half-baked fanfic. At least the Black Fang was pretty interesting. It's held back a bit by a weak plot, but Fire Emblem Blazing Sword is still a great game thanks to its lovable characters and excellent gameplay. If you're interested in checking out the series but don't know where to start with this game. You won't regret it.
Interesting maneuver.
For a Wii game, you'd expect Radiant Dawn to perform a lot better than it did, but minimal marketing, being a sequel to a late GameCube game, and badly translating the difficulty options may have ruined those chances. Anyway, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn is a very worthy sequel to Path of Radiance. Nearly everything great about FE9's gameplay also applies to its sequel. Bonus experience is back and better than ever. It's a big help with keeping units from falling off, and it does a great job at encouraging you to play better in combat. It helps that the map design is also pretty solid. There are a few slow or annoying maps here and there, and the clunky battle animations don't help, but the majority of them are really interesting, with some creative objectives. The introduction of ledges also adds a lot more depth to the maps, really playing around with the environments. Also, classes have an extra tier in this game. Not only is it super satisfying to see your units evolve even further, but it also strengthens the continuity by showing how much the returning units have grown since Path of Radiance, which is something Mystery of the Emblem and its remake neglected to do for the most part. The art and character design are phenomenal, and might be Sachiko Wada's best work on the series to date. And the music. Holy turn it up. It's one of the best soundtracks in the whole series. Every piece contributes so much to their respective scenes and battles. It's unreal. The story has some issues, but it still does a great job at expanding on what was established in Path of Radiance. With one exception, which we will get to, it might be the most large-scale story in the series to date. Its dire opening contrasts greatly with Path of Radiance's more humble beginnings, and it presents us with an interesting premise: the former enemy nation after their defeat. It's a little bogged down by most of the new characters feeling pretty flat, most likely due to how hard they f***ed up the support system. I'm also pretty mixed on Micaiah as a protagonist. She serves her purpose and has some good personal stakes, but she's also quite naive and makes several dumb decisions. She's essentially Corrin's much more tolerable precursor. Also, her relationship with Sode is a little sus.
Says the Violet Evergarden fan.
Oh, shut up! Then we reunite with Alencia in part 2. Her struggles with putting up with those who reject her dreams of unity between Bjork and Luguz is a great way to expand her character, and I wish it was more fleshed out. The Grail Mercenaries entrance at the end of part 2 was honestly more hype than Thor's Wakanda entrance in Infinity War. I will fight you on that. Ike isn't quite as interesting as he was in Path of Radiance, but he's still a strong character who gains some more satisfying development. The rest of the returning characters are also a lot of fun for the most part. Part 3 does a great job at broadcasting the war from two different viewpoints without outright villainizing either of them, and we learn some interesting truths about Tellius as well. There are still some pretty damn contrived moments, particularly at the Blood Pacts and Ashura's Awakening, but all of it builds to an amazing final part. Aside from Sephron's reveal, which could have been handled a lot better in my opinion, the finale is one of the best in the entire series, and the ending is so damn satisfying. This game is flawed for sure, and it's not quite as good as Path of Radiance, but I love Radiant Dawn nonetheless for how excellently it completes that game's story, world, and themes while still being a great game on its own merits.
Chris! Where the f are we?
Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem is the remake of Mystery of the Emblem's second book. This was their chance to bring the rest of Mar's story over to the West, but due to the series' declining sales at the time, this game was kept in Japan. It's the only game since Binding Blade to only release in Japan. It's a shame too, because New Mystery of the Emblem is easily the best Arcanea game. Every quality of life improvement seen in Shadow Dragon returns, along with some new ones such as the first appearance of Casual Mode, allowing people to play without the fear of permanently losing units. These changes really streamline the game, making it much more fun to play than the original. It's also really hard, even on normal mode. I don't really recommend playing on hard or higher due to the ambush spawns, but if you think you can stomach them, go ahead. If not, normal mode still puts up a fun, fair challenge without same turn reinforcements. I barely felt the need to reclass in Shadow Dragon, but in New Mystery, it's a great tool for organizing different strategies for each map. The remake also makes a few changes to the individual maps, often for the better. In Chapter 17, it's now much easier to identify which enemies are passive and which aren't. And remember how Chapter 19 restricted battles to the middle and end back in FE3? Now more enemies show up as you progress through the map, making it feel much more like the final leg of a war. Also, they added an avatar, and they're there. Chris doesn't really serve much of a purpose in the grand scheme of things, but it's nice to have a character you can make any class you want. Props for having the option to not use them and not giving them any bearing on the plot. Along with Chris comes a brand new prologue that acts as a decent resting point between the two wars, and the character interactions in it are quite a bit of fun. Beyond the prologue, this game decides to finally give Arcanea's characters some, character through the base conversations. They're not necessarily great, but at least there's something. The star of the new show is Katarina. Her side story about her life with the assassins is really heartfelt, and it once again proves that you're not just fighting soldiers, you're fighting people. It's a shame that the new maps kinda suck gameplay wise, but at least we got a great subplot with them without having to kill our own units. The main story remains as solid as it was on the SNES, but the ending this time around is immensely satisfying. I thought it was fine back in FE3, but the added scenes of everyone celebrating their victory after all they've been through elevate it beyond belief. Also, the art is stunning, the soundtrack is beautiful, and they even added in the characters and maps from BSFE. I sincerely hope New Mystery of the Emblem makes its way over to the West in some way, shape, or form. The rest of the world needs to witness the best of Marth's adventures.
I can excuse racism, but I draw the line at animal cruelty.
Fire Emblem Path of Radiance is the significantly better prequel to Radiant Dawn, and given how great Radiant Dawn is, that's saying a lot. Path of Radiance has a rather lighthearted start compared to other installments. Rather than being a lord from a high-class origin, Ike is simply a common mercenary, working for his dad's company alongside his friends. The Grail mercenaries and their interactions are charming and fun, investing you in them before the story even truly kicks off. It's not until Soren arrives in Chapter 4 when we get any introductory world building, let alone word of a war. Once the mercs encounter Daein forces and take Alencia under their care, things don't stop escalating. The game does a great job at easing you into the world and characters before the story even truly kicks off. It might actually do the best job at that in the whole series. Let's move away from the story for a bit and take a look at the gameplay. It's not much different from how it was in the GBA, but it's still a lot of fun. It's nice to wind down in between chapters at the base, and I'm glad it's just a menu that doesn't take up most of the runtime like the monastery from Three Houses. You can witness many conversations without having to place your units together, and it also features this game's single best new feature: bonus experience. What a godsend of a new feature. With it, you can keep your main units topped up while also helping underleveled units catch up to them. If that wasn't enough, the maps all have their own side objectives that give off more bonus experience depending on your performance, encouraging you to play to the best of your ability. It helps that most of the maps are really well designed and engaging, keeping you on your toes at all times. Skills are back from Yggdrasil, and now you can assign specific skills to certain units. Let's move away from the gameplay and talk a bit about one of the narrative's strongest aspects: Ike. Like I said, instead of being some noble prince, Ike is just your everyday mercenary. This aspect already makes him more relatable than most of the series' other protagonists, and it helps that his words and actions feel believable. His growth from a regular guy struggling to match his father to a hero who brings peace to an entire continent for a time is immensely satisfying. He is not alone in being well written, because the rest of the game's cast is fantastic as well. Characters like Jill, Soren, and Alencia are among some of my favorite characters in the entire series, and the game also has some great villains such as the bad Vitrine and the honorable Black Knight. Over the course of the story, we learn so much about Tellius and its various tragedies, such as the rough relations between the Bjork and the Lagoos, and the fall of nearly an entire race due to a blame game. The entire continent feels so well crafted to the point of feeling realistic, despite it being a fantasy setting. Path of Radiance is by no means a perfect game. The maps that suck really suck, the battle animations are super slow, and the voice acting in the FMVs is honestly abysmal. The OVA had better voice acting, but none of that takes away from how fantastic Path of Radiance is as a whole. It's the kind of game I could dedicate a whole video to, with how much brilliance there is to talk about. It's a damn shame Path of Radiance sold as poorly as it did, since it is, in my opinion, the best Fire Emblem game to release outside Japan. Which means, if you want to play the top 2 Fire Emblem games, you're gonna have to sail the 7 seas. I'm sorry, that's just a case of Nintendo being Nintendo. Fire Emblem Thracia 776 is a cruel game. It lures you into a false sense of security with its first few chapters and then burns away the training wheels immediately after. It quickly becomes one of the most frustrating and punishing games in the franchise, and I wouldn't want it any other way. Simply put, the game's design goes perfectly with its scenario. Leif has spent his whole life on the run from the Empire. The whole Thracian Peninsula is deep under the oppression of the likes of Raedric and the Loptir cult. As such, Leif and his army are never given a moment to breathe. As the player, you must stay on your toes at all times if you even want a chance to come out on top. You start with 0 gold, and you must capture enemies and take their stuff to make up for that. Your units can also tire out if they fight for too long, so you must train up as many units as possible and carefully decide on who to bring for each map. Not only do these these mechanics blend perfectly with the dire story, but they also incorporate more strategy than ever seen before, or after. As the game goes on, and as the enemies grow stronger and smarter, so do you. It's super satisfying unleashing every dirty trick in the book back at those who've likely done the same to you over the course of the game. This is especially true in regard to staves, which are at their best in Thracia. Any staff you steal from enemies can be used in your favor, and since a lot of them have infinite range, they can really turn the tide of battle. This is a weird analogy, but Thracia's kind of the Doom Eternal of Fire Emblem. Hear me out. Both games give you lots of powerful tools to play with, and they expect you to use all of them due to how fiendishly difficult they are. This game also introduces various long-time mechanics such as rescuing units and guidance chapters, the latter of which are great rewards for fulfilling objectives in certain chapters. Let's step away from the gameplay for a moment and step back to this game's protagonist, Leaf. Out of the over 600 characters in this franchise, Leaf is my favorite. Like I said, he spent his whole life in hiding, and as such, he's very inexperienced with leading an army. This is felt early on when he gets himself captured by Raedric, and even later on when he unknowingly sends his soldiers off to get ambushed. But at no point does he feel like a Mary Sue or a naive idiot. He's genuinely trying to do the best he can within the circumstances. Seeing him grow from a frail fugitive to a brave prince who could match the likes of Seliph is just powerful. Leaf earns the title of Crusader, not because he has holy blood, but because of his strong will and perseverance. It's such a fantastic character arc, and it's only a small fraction of a much larger story. Thracia 776 isn't for everyone because it's hard as balls, but I love nearly every turn of my playthrough, and it's easily the peak of the series in terms of gameplay. And yet, there is still a game that surpasses it. And if you know the series, there's a good chance you already know what it is. Where do I begin? Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War deserves to stand up there with the likes of Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI as one of the best RPGs of the 90s. It takes everything this series says and does well and amplifies them beyond belief. Its opening tells you everything you need to know about the world and characters at that point. It spends the prologue and first chapter letting you ease yourself into Yggdrasil with a simple story and relatively lighthearted tone, only to throw all that away in chapter 2. What follows is a dark, emotional roller coaster full of twists, turns, tragedies, and triumphs. But at no point does it ever feel like shallow misery porn reliant on shock value. All the dark moments and tragedies have meaning to them. They all serve their purpose. I understand every decision the characters make. Speaking of which, nearly all the characters in this game are outstanding. Even the ones who barely do anything serve their purpose, leaving the more important ones to go through their own profound arcs, which perfectly fit into the large-scale story. Of course, the best game in a franchise can't be carried to the top just by its story. It's also gotta have great gameplay, which is something this game is lucky enough to possess. Rather than covering battles at individual set pieces, Genealogy showcases the warfare on a countrywide scale. The maps in this game are massive, and they cut into each other to form a full map of the continent. The game takes full advantage of the large maps by having multiple objectives to seize, with several big battalions of enemies spread across. More than any other game in the series, Genealogy truly feels like you're fighting a war. You have to put effort into your formations to overcome the waves of enemies, or just send your strongest unit to solo them all. Yeah, I'm one of those players. You have to try to liberate the country as quickly as possible, with as minimal destruction as possible. You have to worry about managing resources while the enemy advances. These mechanics may sound overly clunky, which they are, but they all tie together beautifully in the long run. Various plot points also occur during battle, and you can see them play out in the middle of maps, weaving the story and gameplay together seamlessly. The game explores so many different themes like loss, governmental corruption, and the struggle to carry on legacy. All of it perfectly ties into the devastating mid-game and the sublime ending. Seeing Yggdrasil enter a new era of peace after so many years of corruption and bloodshed is incredible. This game is incredible. Yeah, it has problems. It can sometimes take way too long for you and the enemy to drag units across the map. The map design itself occasionally sucks. You have to pay gold to trade items, and Deirdre is honestly kind of underdeveloped. But they're nothing compared to what Genealogy means on a greater scale. And that's not even considering its high-quality battle animations, its introductions of long-time mechanics, and its absolutely phenomenal soundtrack, among other things. I could go on for hours about how much this game means to me, but I'm a little low on runtime. Simply put, Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War is a true work of art. I am dying for it to make its way over to the West, be it in the form of an official ROM dump or a good remake. The whole world needs to experience the tales of Sigurd and Seliph. Be it through this game or its inevitable remake, I still have plans to eventually review the Holy War. Don't worry.